After the massacre, Earth declared, "No more mercy." The flowers were wrong. I noticed them before anything else as I walked into the ceremony hall aboard Massacre Station, on what was supposed to be the most significant day in the history of human diplomacy. Someone had arranged them along the central table in perfectly matched rows, every stem the same height, every petal open at the exact same angle. Real flowers do not behave that way. Real flowers push toward light and crowd their neighbors and lean unevenly because growth is not a controlled process. These looked like the idea of flowers, like someone had searched the word and arranged whatever the search returned. I noted it in my log, not because it had any consequence, because notation was the reflex of 40 years, and 40 years of reflexes do not suspend themselves for the significance of the occasion. The Vorath delegation entered the hall at 13:47 station time. There were 9 of them. I had studied the Vorath for 11 years, not from a comfortable distance. The way you study something you are going to stake your professional credibility on, your word on, the combined weight of an entire planet's diplomatic effort on. I had read their translated records and behavioral analyses and every field report filed by every contact team that had gotten close enough to produce documentation. I had sat across from Vorath negotiators in rooms with failing air recyclers and bad coffee, and I had learned, slowly and with great specificity, how to read a species that does not express itself through facial movement or volume. The crest ridges along the skull were one signal, the spacing between footsteps was another. The position of the hands mattered most, close to the body when something was already decided, loose and outward when there was genuine engagement. All 9 of the delegation had their hands close to their bodies. Not the close of nerves or ceremony, the controlled, deliberate close of something that was already resolved before they walked through the door. I logged it at 13:51. Vorath delegation behavioral pattern deviation. Recommend pre-session evaluation before proceeding. The response arrived at 13:58. Proceed as planned. Session begins in 5 minutes. I read the response. I considered pushing back. I had pushed back in smaller situations for smaller stakes and been overruled for it. And over 40 years I had learned that a diplomatic apparatus is not built for last-minute reversals based on one person's reading of hand positioning. The apparatus moved on its momentum. One person's concern log was a notation in the margin of a much larger document. I stood up. Moving toward the corridor exit was practical. The encrypted relay sometimes dropped near the center of the hall due to the station's interior wall density, and I needed a clean signal line for log transmissions. I moved toward the exit the way you move when a ceremony is minutes from starting, and you do not want to be the disruption that delays it. I was 6 meters from the door. The hall stopped existing. There is no sequence I can give you that would make that moment linear, because it was not linear. There was the hall. Then there was pressure and light, and a sound so large it passed out of the category of sound and became a physical condition of the air itself. The corridor wall reached me before I had processed anything. My shoulder hit it, then the side of my head, then I was on the floor of an intact corridor, looking at the ceiling, while the threshold behind me opened into something that no longer had a ceiling or walls or any of the components of a room. My log records a 40-second gap. When the record restarts, I am already reaching for the emergency oxygen line. Left side, 3 meters. I had read Massacre Station's full safety specifications the evening before boarding because the kind of person I am does not trust that someone else has read them on her behalf. I pulled the line. I sealed the collar. I moved. 6 hours. I pulled myself along the interior guide rails through what remained of the station, in reduced gravity and low light, the oxygen counter running in my left ear, my body doing the work of movement while my mind did what it always did. It documented a section of the treaty paper at the junction of 2 corridor segments floating. printed on heavy stock, because someone in the protocol division had decided that a 40-year peace agreement deserved to be printed on something with real weight and texture. A coffee thermos with a blue lid, sealed, rotating in slow null gravity. A translation device from one of the delegate tables, its screen cracked clean through, its power indicator still green, still steady, as if the machine had not received the news. A shoe. White, child-sized. The left heel worn more significantly than the right, from the specific repeated motion of a child who dragged that foot slightly, a small imperfect habit, the kind that develops without anyone noticing until months have passed. The toe stitching was red, one red lace undone. I logged the brand. I logged the wear pattern. I logged which foot it belonged to. I moved past it and continued toward the emergency beacon on the outer ring. I did not think about the child. I thought about the wear pattern, a left-footed drag, the kind of small imperfection that a parent eventually identifies through months of close watching, mentions once with a mixture of mild exasperation and something that is not quite affection but lives right next to it, and then catalogs into the permanent archive of everything that makes that specific person who they are and no one else. I held that thought like a guide rail. I kept moving. The rescue shuttle found my beacon at the 6-hour mark. 2 crew members. They did not ask questions, which I was grateful for. One of them put a thermal wrap around my shoulders without being asked. I held it closed with both hands and looked out the small forward porthole at the scattered geometry of what had been Sarikei Station. I looked for 2 seconds, then I stopped looking. The debrief room on the rescue carrier smelled like cleaning solution and recycled air. General Gareth Cole sat across from me. He was a large man with a quiet voice and a face that had once been easy and had learned, through decades of difficult work, how to hold things in reserve. He asked organized questions. I gave organized answers. He made notes in a way that suggested he had been making notes in that same precise style for his entire career. He asked about the delegation's behavior in the minutes before the event. I described what I had logged at 13:51. He wrote it down without reacting. He asked about my passage through the damaged sections of the station. I told him what I had documented. He wrote it down. He asked about my physical condition. I gave him what I could assess. At the end of the debrief, he looked at me and asked how I was doing. I filed a concern log at 13:51, I said. Voreth Delegation Behavioral Pattern Deviation. Recommend pre-session evaluation. Response came at 13:58. Proceed as planned. I set my hands flat on the table. That is how I am doing. He held my gaze for a moment. He said nothing. The footage from Sarikei reached Earth within 40 minutes of the event. Every screen, every government broadcast, every personal device with an active network connection. 400,000 people in 12 seconds. The Voreth had not claimed the strike, had not denied it, had transmitted nothing at all in the hours following. Other species responded within hours. Condolences arrived from 18 different governments in the first 3 hours alone. The Helvari Consortium, which controlled 3 of the major trade corridors adjacent to Earth's territorial space, began internal discussions about what a destabilized Earth might mean for regional economic positioning. The Drenathi sent an envoy to the UN mission with a sealed communication. The Galvari Council issued formal statements of sympathy in 14 languages. Earth responded to none of it. Not a single transmission, not one acknowledgement, not a response to the condolences or the formal protests or the Helvari's quiet repositioning. Earth went silent, not the silence of a people overcome, not the silence of a species that had not yet found the words, the silence of something that had already finished becoming what it was going to be. I knew because I was inside it. The moment General Cole closed his notebook, 2 people I had never seen before entered the room carrying clearance codes I had never encountered in my career. They placed a reassignment document on the table in front of me. No department heading, no procedural reference number, no chain of command notation that connected it to any framework I recognized. I looked at the general. He was looking at the table. I signed it. 40 years teaches you that some documents are not asking questions. They announce that the question has already been answered in a room you were not in, and your signature is the acknowledgement of that fact, not the decision itself. Before leaving the carrier, I went to the nearest communications terminal and printed my concern log. All of it. 1,437 words, accumulated over 8 years of negotiations. I folded the printout once and placed it in the breast pocket of my uniform. I could feel its edge against my ribs when I breathed. The last entry was 7 words. Voreth delegation behavioral pattern. Recommend delay. I did not read it again. I only needed to know it was there. The transport to the facility had no windows. Not windows that had been covered for security. No windows at all. It had been designed from the beginning without them, by people who had no intention of letting their passengers know the route. I sat in the interior compartment with 11 others whose names I would not learn for several days. They had the shared expression of people who had been told exactly as much as they needed to know, and were now sitting with the weight of everything they had not been told. 9 hours. I counted the time by measuring my breathing against the ambient hum of the transport's drive system, a technique from my early diplomatic career, when the transit routes were long, and the mission briefings were incomplete, and there was nothing productive to do except wait and stay sharp. The facility was below ground level, not dramatically recessed, but enough that the surface gave no indication of the scale of what was underneath it. We were processed in stages at the entry point. Biometric registration, clearance confirmation, a communication protocol briefing that lasted 3 minutes because the protocol had a single rule stated in multiple ways. Nothing out. Nothing verbal, nothing written, nothing transmitted through any channel until authorized. The first person who spoke to me by name was Elise Morgan. She was an engineer, tall, close-cropped hair, with the focused and slightly hollowed look of someone who had not had an uninterrupted night of rest in over 2 months and had stopped expecting to. She shook my hand and told me she had been following the Sarakai negotiations closely. The framework had 11 clauses, she said. You wrote 8 of them. 8 of the 11, I said. She almost smiled. It looked like something her face did not have much practice with anymore. Come with me. She took me down 2 corridors to a room that was, in practical terms, a wall of data. Floor-to-ceiling screens, every one of them live, every one of them updating. Production tallies, fleet assembly numbers, logistical chains tracing paths across multiple continents, several ocean-based platforms, and 3 orbital stations. I looked at the numbers for a long time without speaking. Day 3, Elise said before I asked. We started converting on day 3. After Sarakai. Yes. I read through the production columns again. My professional language was treaty clauses and behavioral analysis, and the specific weight of words in agreements. Numbers were not my primary instrument, but you do not need to be fluent in a language to recognize when you are reading something of enormous significance. You only need context, and I had 40 years of it. The orbital shipyards, I said. All converted. The manufacturing platforms in the southern corridor. Those as well. The civilian construction platforms in the northern orbital belt. Everyone with a structural frame wide enough to be repurposed. She scrolled to a secondary display. The industrial capacity was always there. Earth always had it. The only thing missing was the decision. The decision had been made on day 2. I learned the details gradually, through conversations over the following weeks that were never formally labeled as briefings. A closed meeting, a small room, under 3 hours from start to finish. A single directive that authorized the chain that was now running on every screen in front of me. The fleet numbers did not look like a military count. They looked like a measurement of something that already existed, the way you measure a coastline or a mountain range, not built so much as revealed. I asked Elise what my role was. Transmission, she said. You transmit the declaration before anything else happens. What declaration? She opened a secondary document on the nearest screen. 11 sentences. I counted twice. 11 sentences with no ultimatums and no conditions and no if-then structure. They were not the language of threat. They were not the language of demand. They were the language of announcement, a precise statement of what had already been decided and what was, as of the moment of transmission, in the process of occurring. I read the 11 sentences 3 times. I thought, but did not say, that 11 sentences was a short document for the weight it was carrying. I had spent 8 years on 11 clauses in the Massacre framework. Those 11 clauses, on their heavy paper, were somewhere in the debris field of the station that no longer existed. These 11 sentences were on a screen in front of me, and they were doing in 11 sentences what the framework had spent 8 years trying to prevent. When do we transmit? I said. When the fleet is in position, Elise said. Day 91. I went back to the production figures. I did the arithmetic with the deliberateness of someone who does not want to reach the answer ahead of themselves. I reached it anyway. The galaxy has not noticed this, I said. They've noticed Earth is silent, Elise said. They've read the silence as grief. The Helvari believe Earth is in institutional collapse. The Drenathi submitted a conflict mediation proposal through standard channels last week. She pulled up a communications log. We acknowledged receipt. And nothing else. Nothing else. I thought about what the Helvari believed, what the Drenathi expected, the 31 other species currently observing Earth's behavior and filtering the silence through frameworks built from their own histories of loss and disruption. Every one of them was calibrated for the signals they knew. A species that had just suffered a catastrophic event would broadcast its grief, would argue publicly about next steps, would issue formal statements, because the act of issuing statements was part of how communities processed overwhelming events. Earth had not issued statements. Earth had redirected. There was a man at the facility named Felix Adair who ran the logistical coordination for the orbital production platforms. He was compact and precise and communicated in short sentences that contained all the information necessary and none that was not. I worked near him for 3 weeks before we had a real conversation, and the conversation was about the Massacre framework, which he had also studied. 8 clauses, he said one evening in the facility's shared workspace. 8 of 11, I said. The arbitration clause was yours, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. It was a good clause. It assumed the other party wanted an agreement, I said. He looked at me for a moment. They didn't. No, I said, they didn't. He went back to his screens. I went back to mine. I had a small office in the facility, a desk, a screen, and a chair that was slightly too low in a way that was specific enough to be intentional or specific enough to simply be a badly calibrated chair. I read the declaration daily. I read the fleet figures daily. I read the behavioral profiles I had written over my career for 26 of the 31 species currently observing the situation. None of them were calibrated for this. Admiral Leon Hart came to my office on day 87. He stood in the doorway in a way that made the doorway seem smaller than it was. He had the particular quality of someone who had organized a great deal of force into a very contained space and did not need to demonstrate the fact. He told me the fleet would be in position on day 91. He told me the declaration would be transmitted on day 91 before any action, to every Vorath frequency simultaneously. Military, civilian, governmental, every channel they used. Civilian channels, I said. Yes. I looked at him. That used to be my decision to make. It still is, he said. The document says what it says. You're the one who transmits it. He left. I sat in the chair that was slightly too low and read the declaration a fourth time, and did not change a word, which was the first document I had not revised after 4 readings in my entire career. I pulled the concern log from my breast pocket. I did not open it. I held it in my hand for a moment, the folded paper. The 1,437 words under my fingers. Then I put it back. 3 days. On day 88, the Helvari Consortium formalized administrative claims on 2 of the Earth trade corridors they had been repositioning around since the 3rd week of Earth silence. They filed the claims through standard Galactic Trade Administration channels. The automated Earth system logged the filing and issued a standard receipt acknowledgement. Logged. On day 89, I finalized the transmission protocols, frequencies, encoding, confirmation structures or the absence of them. You do not transmit a document like this and then wait to confirm the other side received it. Waiting for confirmation implies the possibility that you would resend if they had not. There was no resend in this. On day 90, I read the declaration one final time. I did not change a word. On day 91, I walked to the transmission room. The command ship had a forward observation bay that was not listed in its standard specifications. I found it on my 2nd day aboard, through a maintenance corridor that connected to a sealed compartment with a reinforced forward panel that was, in practical terms, a window the size of a large door. I went there at 04:00 on the morning of day 91, when the corridors were quiet and the rest of the command staff was cycling through brief rest periods. I sat on the deck in front of that window and looked at what Earth had built. I had read the production figures for 3 months. I had studied the assembly tallies and the logistical chains and the fleet composition breakdowns until the numbers were as familiar to me as treaty clauses. Numbers I understood intellectually. Reading them was a different condition entirely. The fleet moved around me in organized formation, and it was large in a way that the word large was not designed to handle. Not imposing in the way a single massive ship is imposing, with its scale as the point. Imposing the way a plane is imposing. The way a coastline is imposing, not because of height or drama, but because of extent. You looked in one direction and then another, and it continued in all of them, because it had been built by a species that, when it decides to build, applies the full weight of its industrial history to the problem and does not stop until the problem is answered. I sat there for 1 hour. Then I went to the transmission room. The crew on the command ship was disciplined in the specific way that comes from extended periods of preparation. I had been around military personnel enough over my career to know the difference between troops who are waiting to act and troops who are ready to act. Waiting has a particular restlessness underneath the surface. Ready is still. Every crew member I passed in those corridors was still. The transmission officer was a young man named Callum Reed. He had a steady quality and hands that moved across the equipment with the efficiency of someone who had run this particular sequence many times in preparation. He acknowledged me when I entered, confirmed the encryption protocols, and told me we were 7 minutes from the authorized transmission window. I stood at the transmission console. I had a physical copy of the declaration, printed the evening before. I also had it on the screen. I had memorized it 3 weeks ago, which had not been a deliberate act. You read something 40 times and it stops being a text and starts being part of how your mind is organized. The transmission window opened. I transmitted. The declaration went out on every Voreth frequency simultaneously. Civilian bands, military command channels, governmental networks, every encoded and open channel that our intelligence teams had mapped over 11 years of contact. The signal traveled at the speed that signals travel, and somewhere ahead of us in Voreth space, it arrived. What arrived before the signal was the fleet itself. The Voreth had observation posts on the border of their territorial space, as any advanced species does. The observation crews filed alerts the moment our fleet entered their sensor range. I was monitoring the intercepted Vorath communications through the translation relay in real time, the text scrolling in my earpiece as Nora Hendricks, the ship's senior translation officer, parsed it. I listened to the Vorath count. The first alert cited 12 vessels. The second alert, filed 40 seconds later, revised that number upward substantially. The third alert, filed 2 minutes after the second, used a tone in the Vorath communication structure that I recognized from my studies. It was the tone of a report that the sender does not want to be the one filing, because the content of the report is going to change something permanently. The Vorath kept counting. They counted past the point where the numbers carried the strategic meaning they were supposed to carry. They counted into a range where the numbers were no longer a military assessment. They were a geological fact. Nora looked at me from across the translation station. I did not say anything. I did not need to. She had been translating Vorath communications for 6 years. She understood what the shift in tone meant without requiring it to be named. The declaration arrived in Vorath space approximately 11 minutes after the fleet became visible on their sensors. It arrived on every frequency. Civilian residents of Vorath population centers heard it on the same channels they used for ordinary communications. Military command received it on encrypted channels alongside their fleet assessments. The Vorath government received it through every diplomatic channel that had ever been used between our species. The declaration said what it said. I had read it 43 times. It said, in 11 sentences, that Earth was not seeking negotiation, that the Sarakei event had produced a specific outcome, that Earth was arriving to produce a specific outcome in return, that this was not a punitive campaign in the emotional sense of the word. It was a correction, and it named in precise terms what the correction would consist of. The final sentence stated that the Vorath had 6 hours. 6 hours for whatever they chose to do with 6 hours. 6 hours from signal receipt, we calculated. Callum confirmed the transmission. He confirmed reception on 17 monitored Vorath channels. He looked at me and waited. "Thank you," I said. I went back to the observation bay. I sat on the deck. Outside the reinforced panel, the fleet moved in its organized quiet. I checked the breast pocket of my uniform. The concern log was there. 6 hours. The Vorath responded in 2. Not a surrender, a counter-transmission. The Vorath military command on their primary encrypted channel opened a response line. Nora flagged it immediately. I was in the operations room when it came through. Admiral Hart was already there. The translation came in real time, and it was what I would have predicted if someone had asked me 2 weeks ago what a Vorath military command would say when presented with our fleet's position. They asked for 48 hours. Hart looked at me. The look was not a question. It was an acknowledgement that this was the point in the sequence where the diplomatic function was relevant. 6 hours, I said. As transmitted, Hart said. We did not alter the timeline. The Vorath attempted 3 separate communication lines over the following 4 hours, 2 to the command ship's general frequency, 1 to a specific diplomatic channel that had been dormant since before Sarakei. I monitored all 3. The first 2 were formal requests for extended negotiation time. The third was different. The third came in on the old diplomatic channel, and the voice on it when Nora translated it was an older Vorath, high caste register. The kind of deliberate vocal structure used by senior governmental figures. He asked to speak to whoever had sent the declaration. Hart looked at me. This time the look was a question. Put it through, I said. The transmission connected. There was a quality to the silence on the other side that I recognized from many years of difficult negotiations. The silence of a counterpart who is deciding how to begin. You are the one who wrote the document, the Vorath official said through Nora's translation. It was not a question. I transmitted it, I said. A pause. The language is diplomatic language. Yes. You are a diplomat. I said. The capacity was recently reorganized. Another pause. Longer. In the background of his transmission, I could hear the particular ambient sound of a governmental operations room under pressure. Multiple voices, movement, the texture of an institution trying to manage an event it had not prepared for. We did not expect you to respond this way, he said. I had a choice about how to respond to that. I made it in approximately 3 seconds. I know, I said. The call ended, 6 hours elapsed, the fleet moved. What followed lasted 11 days. I am not the correct person to describe the tactical elements of those 11 days, because tactics were not my function, and I was not positioned to observe them in the way that would make for an accurate account. What I can tell you is what I had access to, what I watched. I watched through every camera feed routed to the command ship's monitoring station. It was a large room with a large number of screens and a small number of people, most of them with headsets and quiet voices, and the kind of focus that makes people stop making unnecessary movements. On day 1, the Vorath defense formations engaged our fleet in the way that a prepared and capable military force engages an opponent it has assessed. They had assessed incorrectly, because their assessment was based on the largest fleet action in Earth's previous military history, which was a fraction of what was in front of them now. But they engaged. They fought with the organization and the commitment of a species that does not concede without resistance. I registered that. I wrote it into the daily log I was keeping. The Vorath fought. On day 3, I received a flagged audio file through the translation relay. Nora had marked it with a single-word note, civilian. It was a fragment of a Vorath public broadcast, not a governmental broadcast, the kind of channel that Vorath communities used for ordinary public communication. The translation was partial because civilian Vorath used a register of the language that differed enough from the formal register to create gaps. But I understood the texture of it. I sat with the file for a long time after I listened to it. I pressed my hand flat against the desk until the pressure was the only thing I could feel. Then I removed my hand and made a notation in my log. Then I continued working. There was a thing I noticed on day 4 that I had expected intellectually but had not prepared to feel directly. 3 other species, none of whom had any involvement in the conflict, went quiet. Not the way Earth had gone quiet, with direction and intent. These were species that had been issuing regular diplomatic communications and public statements and had simply, in the space of 36 hours, stopped. No farewell statement. No formal silence. Just the absence of what had been there before. I ran their behavioral profiles. Fear was a component, but the larger component was something closer to recalibration. These species were revising something fundamental in their understanding of human behavior, and while they were revising it, they were producing no communications, because producing a communication required knowing what to say, and they did not yet know what to say. On day 7, the Helvari Consortium issued a statement withdrawing their administrative claims on the 2 Earth trade corridors they had filed for during Earth silence. The statement used the phrase procedural error, which was not accurate and which everyone involved knew was not accurate. But it was the phrase that allowed the withdrawal to happen without requiring either side to name what had actually occurred. I logged it. I did not comment on it. On day 9, I received a visitor in my operations room. His name was Conrad Gray. He was attached to the military staff as a strategic analyst. Young. The kind of systematic intelligence that processes information quickly and then holds its conclusions carefully, like someone carrying full glasses. He sat across from me and told me that the 11-day timeline was going to be shorter than 11 days. How much shorter? I said. 2 days, he said, possibly 3. I looked at my screens. The Vorath command structure is intact, he said. This will be a formal surrender, not a collapse. They're going to ask for terms. There are no terms, I said. He looked at me steadily. I know, he said. I'm telling you they're going to ask anyway because that's how they know to do this. And when they ask, someone is going to have to receive the ask and redirect it. That's the reorganized capacity, I said. He almost smiled. Yes, he said, that's you. He left. I read the declaration again. The 11th sentence. 6 hours had become 9 days, but the core of the document had not changed. There were no terms. The correction had parameters, and the parameters were in the text, and the text was what it was. On day 10, I received the formal surrender request. It came through the old diplomatic channel again. The same high-cast voice, the same deliberate vocal register. He asked for the terms of cessation. I told him the declaration was the terms, that the parameters outlined in the declaration were not a starting position but a final one. There was a long silence. You were a diplomat, he said. Diplomats negotiate. I transmitted a document, I said. The document is what I transmitted. What you are asking me to do with the document is something the document does not have space for. Another long silence. In the background, his operations room was quieter than it had been on day 1. We will accept, he said. I noted the time. I made a log entry. I thanked him, which was the reflex of 40 years and which I did not examine too closely in the moment. On day 11, the Vorath Supreme Command issued a formal statement of cessation through every channel that their government used. It was precise and organized, and did not attempt to explain the event or position it. It simply stated the fact. The fleet held position. I sat in the observation bay that evening. Outside the forward panel, the fleet was still. The stars around it were the same stars they had always been. Nothing about the stars had changed. I pressed my hand flat against the deck and held it there for a long time. I thought about the shoe. Left heel, more worn than the right. I thought about the concern log in my breast pocket. 1,437 words, 7 words at the end. I thought about what I was supposed to feel. I was not sure the feeling I was actually experiencing had a clean name. It was not triumph. Triumph has a direction. This had no direction. It was more like the moment after a very long calculation when the numbers have produced their answer, and you are looking at the answer and you understand it completely, and you are not ready to use it yet. I stayed in the observation bay until the light in the corridor outside changed from night cycle to morning cycle. Then I went to prepare the address. The preparation room for the galactic address was a communication suite that had been set up specifically for this transmission. 2 walls of equipment, a central transmitter array that could reach 37 monitored species simultaneously on their preferred reception channels. Callum Reed was there again, running the setup checks with the same systematic efficiency he had brought to the declaration transmission. He looked up when I entered. 40 minutes, he said. Thank you, I said. I sat down at the central console and opened the address document on the screen in front of me. I had written the address over the course of the 11 days, not all at once, not by sitting down and producing it from start to finish in a single session. The way you write something when you are not sure what you think until you have written it enough times to find out. I had drafts. I had cut most of them. What remained on the screen was not the original address I had conceived of when Hart first told me this transmission would be my responsibility. The original address had been, if I am honest, a diplomatic document dressed in different clothing. It had used the language of hope and the language of shared futures and the language of corrective justice, which is the language that says a thing happened and we have addressed it, and now we are choosing a new direction. I had removed all of that. What remained was 11 paragraphs, which I had not planned, which may or may not have been significant. The address was not for the Vorath. The Vorath knew what had happened. The Vorath were in the middle of the process of integrating what had happened into the structure of what came next for them, and that was between the Vorath and the parameters of the declaration. The address was for everyone else. 31 species, 31 governments, 31 interpretive frameworks that had been applied to Earth's behavior over the preceding 92 days, most of them incorrectly. The address was going to reach all of them simultaneously, and it was going to say something that could not be unsaid and would be on record in every galactic archive in every language that the Galactic Communication Network supported. That was the weight of the document on the screen in front of me. Callum told me 10 minutes. I read the address one final time. It began simply. It began with Sarakai, not as a history lesson but as a statement of the record. 400,000 people. 12 seconds. Earth had attempted 40 years of diplomatic engagement with the Vorath Collective, produced a framework of 11 clauses across 8 years of close negotiation, and arrived at Sarakai Station to complete a process that had required the patience and commitment of more people than I could name. The address said this without ornamentation. Then it said what Earth had done in 91 days. Not as a demonstration of capability, as a statement of the record. The record was the record. The fleet had been built. It was documented. The correction had been carried out. It was documented. There was no need to expand on the documentation because the documentation was complete. Then the address turned to face the 31 observing species directly. I had thought very carefully about this section. The address did not make threats. Threats are conditional. You threaten when you want a specific behavior change from a specific party in response to a specific concern. Earth was not in that position. Earth had already carried out what a threat would have warned about. The ship had already sailed. The address was not sent from the dock. What the address said was simpler than a threat, and in my experience of 40 years spent understanding how language lands in the minds of its recipients, more effective. It said that Earth was not an empire. It said this clearly and without qualification. Earth did not seek territorial expansion, economic dominance, or political control over any other species. Earth's interests were the interests of any community that exists in proximity to other communities. Trade, exchange, mutual non-interference, the ordinary material of interstellar coexistence. Then it said the other thing. It said that Earth had made 40 years of significant investment in the belief that agreements were the architecture of coexistence, that treaties were the structure that made proximity sustainable, that diplomatic engagement, conducted in good faith, was the mechanism by which species as different as the ones currently sharing this part of the galaxy could maintain stable relations. It said that Earth had held this belief sincerely. It said that the Sarakai event had produced specific information about the limits of that belief. And then, in the sentence I had written and deleted and rewritten 17 times before finding the phrasing that did precisely what I needed it to do without a single word too many, it said this: Earth thanks the Vorath Collective for the clarity of the demonstration. I had spent 3 days on that sentence. It was not a thank you. Everyone who read it would understand it was not a thank you. It was the most precise statement I had ever written. It said, in the language of diplomatic courtesy, that the Vorath had taught Earth something, and that Earth had learned it completely, and that the learning was now the operating principle. The address then listed, without commentary, the parameters of the Vorath cessation agreement: territory, reparations, the specific obligations in the specific sequence in which they would be fulfilled. It was a list and not a narrative, because a list does not explain and does not justify. A list is just the shape of the facts. The final paragraph of the address was also the shortest. Earth is now resuming normal communication with the galactic community. Earth's diplomatic channels are open, as they have always been, for the purposes of trade, exchange, and the management of shared concerns. Earth looks forward to continued engagement with all species in this region and beyond. Earth also notes, for the record, that its production capacity remains at the current level. No further detail was provided. No further detail was necessary. The detail that existed was sufficient detail. The fleet numbers were known. The timeline was known. The record was complete. Callum said, 30 seconds. I straightened the document on the screen, which did not change anything about the document but was the gesture I made when I was ready. I thought about the 31 species receiving this transmission simultaneously. The Helvari, who had spent 91 days repositioning around an Earth they had calculated to be diminished. The Drenathi, who had submitted a mediation proposal to a conflict whose nature they had misread entirely. The 29 others who had watched and assessed and revised their assessments and watched again. I thought about what they would do with this address in the hours and days following its transmission, the meetings they would call, the analysts they would consult, the questions they would ask about their own positions relative to an Earth that had behaved in a way their models had not predicted. I thought about how the address would be quoted in their records, which sentences they would pull, which phrases would become the shorthand for what Earth had done and what Earth was. Callum said, transmitting. I transmitted. I sat at the console while the signal carried the address outward through the communication network, and I thought about nothing for approximately 90 seconds, which was the longest I had not thought about anything in 91 days. Then I thought about Owen Marsh. Owen had been at Sarakei. He had been the lead legal analyst on the framework. He had written Clause 3 and the arbitration clause's subsection, and we had argued about Clause 7 for 2 weeks before arriving at language we both accepted. He had a habit of tapping his pen on any available surface when he was working through a difficult section of text, a reflex that I had found irritating for the first 6 years, and had simply incorporated into the background of my working life by the 8th. I had not let myself think about Owen at Sarakei. There had been nothing useful that came from the thought, and I had many things to do that required thought I could not afford to spend on something without use. Now the address had been transmitted. The work was done. I thought about Owen for exactly as long as I needed to think about Owen. Then I stood up and thanked Callum and walked out of the communications suite. The corridor outside was quiet. It was late in the ship's day cycle, and the operations staff was reduced to the monitoring rotation. I walked through the corridor and through the maintenance passage and into the observation bay. I sat on the deck in front of the forward panel. Outside, the fleet was in its organized stillness. The stars were the stars. In the far distance, at a range visible only through the ship's external sensor overlay, the edge of Voreth territorial space was a marking on a map that would look different in the next set of star charts than it had in the previous one. I sat there for a long time. Nora Hendricks came in at some point. She sat down on the deck next to me without asking whether she should. We did not speak. We looked out at the fleet and at the stars beyond it. At some point she left. I did not check the time. I thought about the Helvari statement that had withdrawn the trade corridor claims. Procedural error, the particular form of language that allows a thing to be undone without naming the reason it is being undone, because naming the reason would require one party or the other to say something neither of them wanted on the record. I thought about the Drenathi mediation proposal that had arrived during Earth silence, a well-organized document from a species that was genuinely committed to the principle that disputes between parties should be resolved through facilitated engagement rather than direct action. They had not been wrong to send it. They had simply been sending it to an Earth that had already made its decision before the proposal arrived. I thought about the 31 species that were, at this moment, reading the address I had just transmitted. I thought about what they were revising in their models of Earth. I thought about what Earth had revised in itself. This was the thing I had been circling for 91 days, not avoiding it, not denying it, circling it with the care you give to a thing whose full shape you are not yet sure of, Earth had not changed its values. Earth had not become something it was not. Earth valued coexistence and exchange and the architecture of agreements. Earth had built 40 years of diplomatic engagement on those values. Earth had also built, in 91 days, the largest fleet in this region of the galaxy. Both things were true. Both things were now on the record. What I had transmitted in the address was an accurate account of both things. The 40 years of diplomatic investment and the 91 days of what the 40 years produced when they arrived at their logical conclusion. The address was not a threat and not a celebration. It was an accurate statement. Earth had believed in the table for 40 years. The table had been used in a specific way. Earth had noted the use. And Earth's production capacity remained at its current level. I reached into my breast pocket. The concern log had been there for 91 days. I had printed it on the rescue carrier in the hours after the debrief. I had folded it once and placed it in the breast pocket of my uniform, and replaced it every time I changed uniforms, so that it moved with me through every room and corridor and transit and installation and command ship and operations center of the preceding 3 months. I took it out. I unfolded it. 1,437 words, 8 years of negotiations, the record of the Sarakei process from the first session to the final morning, notes from meetings, behavioral observations, clause drafts, the specific language arguments that had lasted weeks, the small victories of phrasing that felt at the time like the careful building of something that would hold. The last entry, Day of Sarakei, 1351, 7 words. Voreth delegation behavioral pattern, recommend delay. I read it. I had not read it since the rescue carrier. I had only needed to know it was there. Now I read it in the observation bay, on the deck, with the fleet outside and the stars beyond the fleet and the 31 species somewhere in those stars reading an address that was going to change the structure of something. The 7 words were not a mistake. They were not negligence. They were the correct professional assessment of a situation, filed through the correct channel in the correct format with the correct recommendation. I had done the job. The job had been overruled. The result of the overrule was the result of the overrule. I had carried the 7 words for 91 days because they were the record. Because the record mattered. Because 40 years of my professional existence was built on the principle that the record was the truth, and the truth was what you held on to. The record was complete. I folded the concern log. I stood up. There was a recycling terminal in the corridor outside the observation bay, 2 meters to the right of the entrance. Standard issue. Every corridor, every 30 meters. I walked to it. I placed the concern log inside. I stood in the corridor for a moment. The ship's air recyclers produced their ambient hum. The light was the steady, even light of a ship in organized operation. I went back to the observation bay. I sat on the deck. I looked out at the fleet and the stars. I did not need the record anymore. I was the record now. We tried the table for 40 years. We built it from careful language and careful listening, and the specific kind of patience that does not come naturally to a species as loud and fast and imperfect as humans are. And we held on to it because the alternative was what we had now, and we understood that the alternative was worse. We were right that the alternative was worse. We were also now the alternative. For the record, Earth does not extend credit. What that meant for the 31 species reading the address was something each of them would calculate in their own way, through their own frameworks, and arrive at their own versions of. I did not need to control the calculation. The address was accurate. The fleet numbers were known. The timeline was known. The rest was what it was. I sat in the observation bay for another hour. Then I stood up, smoothed my uniform, and walked back through the maintenance corridor and into the main passage of the command ship. Callum was in the corridor. He was holding 2 cups of coffee and he handed me one without asking, I took it. I did not drink it immediately. I held it with both hands and felt the warmth of it through the cup. "Any responses to the address?" I said. "The Helvari acknowledged receipt," he said. "The Drenathi acknowledged receipt. 14 others acknowledged receipt. Standard formal acknowledgments." "And the others?" "Silent," he said. I nodded. I drank the coffee. It was not good coffee. It was the kind of coffee that a ship's galley produces when the priority is efficiency rather than quality, which is most of the time on most ships. But it was warm, and it was in my hands, and it was a small, specific, real thing in a moment that needed something small and specific and real. "Thank you," I said. Callum went back to his station. I stood in the corridor of the command ship with a cup of bad coffee and the weight of 11 sentences and 9 days and 91 days before that and 40 years before that. And the weight was not unbearable, which I had not been certain of until this moment. The stars outside the hull were still the stars. The fleet was still there. The record was in a recycling terminal 2 corridors back, which meant it was gone, which meant there was no more record to carry. There was only what came next. I finished the coffee. I handed the cup back to Callum when I passed his station. I went to my temporary office on the command ship and sat down in the chair and opened a new log file. The entry field was blank. I typed the date, I typed the time, I typed address transmitted, all channels confirmed, no further concerns logged. I saved the file. I closed it. I did not check the breast pocket of my uniform. There was nothing in it anymore. That was the correct condition. That was exactly what the situation required.